What's up, everybody? So I got another video for you today. I'm going to adjust the suspension on the car. I have Pedders coilovers. They're very similar to BC coilovers. The main things I'm going to go through today with the car, the two important things that people are probably going to care about is, one is how to adjust the rear, because these cars use they're a coilover style setup, but the rear has a separate spring and a separate shock. So you have to actually set the preload, and if you can't find the information on it, that could be a little tricky. And I'm also going to go over the differences between the cheap setups, these setups, and the really expensive setups for anybody that's trying to figure out which route they want to go and what's going to be best for them. So we'll start off. I've already got all the wheels and tires off the car, and I went through with masking tape and I masked the top and rear, and then I measured from here to here. And basically I'm just going to start off adjusting the front, and then I'll go to the rear. Like I said, the rear is probably what people are going to care about the most. The front comes already set up. So basically with this style setup, this is, like I said, the Pedders, and it's extremely similar to the BC. I think they're pretty much exactly the same thing from what they look like. These have a rebound and compression setting on the top. They're 30-way adjustable, but when you adjust the rebound, you're also adjusting the compression. So they're one and the same. They adjust together, and it does a good job, probably sufficient for most people, but that's probably the biggest downfall to this setup. Your preload, it comes preset on the front. That's just how much your spring is compressed. You know, even with the car jacked up in the air, the spring is already compressed to this much. So when you're driving down the road, if you don't have any preload on it, the car can be really bouncy, because basically the car is just sitting on top of the spring and it has room to move, where if you have preload, it keeps everything tight. Like I said, that comes preset on the front. Then you have your ride height, which on these, the big benefit is the ride height actually goes, you undo this collar, and this whole threaded part screws into the body of the shock. The good thing about that is you can adjust the ride height without changing the preload, without changing your rebound and compression settings. It's all individual of itself. And then you also have spring rate, which your spring rate just is determined by what spring you have. If you want to change spring rate, you have to change to a different spring. So that kind of breaks down the middle of the road coilovers. These are probably anywhere from around $1,000 up to $1,600, $1,700, depending on what you go with. This is just the basic Pedders. BC sells a set that's very similar. I think those are $1,200. And I think they also sell a progressive rate spring for this setup, which I think that could get up around the $1,700 range. If you go with the cheap setup, the coilovers that are like $400, you're going to run into, what you're going to get is probably no rebound and compression settings. It's just going to come how it is. The biggest downfall to it is the body of the shock. So this threaded part that screws down into the body to adjust your ride height, the really cheap ones don't have that. And what you're doing is you're actually changing your preload, taking your preload and compressing your preload to change your ride height. And when you do that, you're losing your shock travel. So to me, I would never go the cheap route. It's just horrible. You don't have any rebound and compression most of the time. Your preload is supposed to be set, we'll just say 1/4 inch, because I think that's what the rear is supposed to be set at. Well, if you want to drop the car more, now all of a sudden you have 1 inch of preload, and that's 3/4 inch less shock travel you have with the car, which on a car like this, 3/4 inch is a lot. You're never going to be able to change your spring rate on the cheap ones, because you're not going to call anybody up and say, well, I need 7K spring rate. Well, at least with Pedders or BC, you can call them up and say, hey, I want to change my spring rate. Can you send me different springs? And they'll send you springs to whatever spring rate you want, or you can ask them for advice and say, this is what I'm doing with the car. What do you recommend? And they will send you a spring rate for what you're going to be doing and what's best for your setup. And again, you have the ride height adjustability. That's big. Then when you start talking about the really expensive coilovers, most of them, a lot of times that kind of falls into the drag racing. Like, that's where people benefit a lot from that, because they come with rebound and compression settings that are separate. And that means you can set it to where the car will suck down and come up at 2 different rates, which is big for some things, but honestly for most people it's not going to matter. Like, I don't track the car. If I do, it's going to be an autocross. I'm not going to have time to dial the car in. You know, I'm never going to use the full potential of this setup. So it doesn't make any sense for me to buy more expensive ones. And I think most people are going to fall in that category. And these have been really good. Before I did that, I would spend that money on upgraded sway bars and poly bushings and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off adjusting the front. We're going to loosen this collar, and it just threads up, and then you'll take and you'll grab onto this collar, and these two are locked together, and then this will just screw this whole body, or this whole threaded part, down into the body. And I've already measured here to here. It's 14 inches. So technically we're actually unscrewing this. And as we unscrew this, I need this to measure 14 3/4 inch, because I'm going to raise the car 3/4 of an inch. Alright, so I just finished getting that adjusted. For anybody wondering, what I did was, when I put the tape on there, I put a level on, just so that way when I bumped the rotor, I knew I could take a level and get my tape back to where it was supposed to be, so my measurement wasn't off. That might be a little overkill, but it made me feel better about it. And also, I took the tape measure from there, put 2 little spots where it lines up, and then measured up. And my original measurement was 14 inches. Now it's 14 3/4. Also, for anybody wondering, the reason I didn't measure out 3/4 of an inch on here and go off of that is because 3/4 of an inch here might be an inch out here, might be 7/8 of an inch out here. I'm not sure, but there's a difference when you move it here to what you're actually going to get. The first time I adjusted it, I tried going off of that, and my measurements were never right, so that's why I decided to try it this way this time, and hopefully it works out good. So all I got to do now is lock this collar back down, and then this side's done. You've seen how long it took. It was pretty easy, pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead, finish locking this down, do the other side, put the wheels back on, and then we'll get started on the back. Alright, so I'm back. As you can see, we got the front back together, wheels and tires are back on. And I didn't say this earlier, but the reason I'm raising it up, as you can see, last year my tires were getting into the fender, and it sliced my tires quite a bit, so probably gonna have to get some new tires this year. But my car was slammed. I mean, it was really, really low. Anyways, I'm starting on the back now. What I did was I took the 2 bolts out of the rear sway bar mount, and I dropped the sway bar down because that gives access to get the bolts on the bottom of the shocks. So I'll take those out, and I had to get something to hold the axle up, which I don't have a jack stand that tall, so I used my coil spring compressor. I just put it under the rear end, and then you start lowering the car down onto that after you have this undone, and you've already started to unscrew these. And then once the tension comes off of it, you can go ahead and pull the bolts out. And then really this could be done with the car on 2 jack stands and a jack, and it'd probably be just as easy, if not easier, because you could have 2 jack stands to keep the axle level. I'm going to go ahead and pull these two bolts out, and then we'll be able to take the preload off of the rear springs, and we'll raise those up about 3/4 of an inch, and then we'll have to adjust our shocks, and we'll lower it back down, we'll measure it and see where it's at. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on that. Alright, I got the bolts out of the bottom of the shock mounts. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and raise the car up now, and you'll see that the springs are sitting on this perch and they're pretty tight. They're tight because that's your preload, and I'll go into that in depth more here in a bit after we get it out of there and adjust it. Alright, so here's the spring. You've got your adjustable part here on the bottom, and then this just rests up right up against the body of the car. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise these up, and then I'll take a measurement off it now, measure it up to where I want it, and that's where we'll set it to. And then when we put it back in the car, we'll lower it down, and we'll put some tension on this with the body of the car so it's already compressed a little bit, and that'll be our preload. And I'm going to put about 1/4 inch on it. Alright, so what I'm doing is I'm just laying this down on its side and then breaking the two loose. As you can see, it goes pretty easy. And then I just unthread it and unthread the other one. When I started, it had a 1/4 inch gap between the bottom and that bottom ring. So I'm taking the caliper, measuring until it comes out. I did the last one 0.97, so that's where I want to get this one to. It's 0.88. Alright, and then you just tighten them back down, opposite way. And that's it. And then you can take and set your spring back on top. Alright, so that measured out right to where I want it. We just take it. I already put the other one back in the car. As you can see, it's got a lot bigger gap between the bottom and that bottom adjuster ring. And then we just take it and slide it back up in there, set it down, and then we will lower the car. Basically, I'll just lower it a little bit at a time until I feel all the tension come off of this, and then I'll lower the car another 1/4 of an inch, and that'll be our preload. So without the preload, like right now it has 0 preload. It would be technically negative preload if that's a thing. I don't know if it is. But what could happen is if you went over a bump and your car came off the ground, or you hit a really big bump and the car bounced, essentially if the axle dropped down this far, I mean, it could literally just slide right out if your shock wasn't locked up high enough. So by dropping the car down and putting a 1/4 inch on it, it's already got preload on it. Without any preload on it, even if we just set it right to, say I brought the car down right now to the top of the spring and set it there, well, you'd have a lot of bounce in the car because it's basically just riding right on top of it. You don't already have it compressed at all to help absorb some of that shock. So it's just sitting there bouncing around. So we lower it down, and then it starts touching it. We take it down another 1/4 of an inch, and I'll do each side separately so I know I get 1/4 of an inch on it. Once that's done, we'll go through, loosen this ring, and then we'll undo this shock body, lower it down until it matches up with that bolt hole. Basically, this will just unscrew. Once that lines up and we've already got our 1/4 inch of preload, then we know that's where we need to be at. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. I'll show you once I get either halfway, or once I'm done, I'll go back over it. Right at 15 means we got our 1/4 inch of preload. And then I'm just going to go ahead, undo this locking collar and get that down to where I can get that bolt in, and this side will be set, and I'll go back through and redo the same thing on the other side. I'll have to put the sway bar back up, drop the car down, we'll measure it, and it'll probably settle a little from there. So, alright, one more thing. So make sure you undo that locking collar before you do anything. When you start adjusting the suspension, break that free, because that was a pain in the butt. I had to take a really long screwdriver and wedge in there just to keep it from moving around. It was on there a lot tighter than the front ones were, so just keep that in mind. Alright, so I got everything bolted back up. Can't speak today. The only thing I have left to do is tighten these lock collars down for the shocks. I've already tightened all that stuff down. I need to take the tape off, put the wheels on, and remeasure it. But my measurement from here to here was 3/4 of an inch more than when I did my 14. I got 14 3/4 now. So it should be right. When I set it down, I know it's going to look a little tall, but hopefully it settles to where I want it and just doesn't rub anymore. I tried to keep this video fairly short, so that's why I kind of rushed through it, or it seemed like I rushed through it. I didn't have much time today, but if you guys have any questions, or you just want to know anything about this setup, or if I like it, I mean, I do like it. So any questions, just leave it in the comments section. I'm going to throw the wheels and tires back on, then I'll get a couple more shots of it, and that'll be it. So I'll show you the car here in a minute. Alright, what's up? We're back. So I got the car all buttoned up. I took it down the road about half a mile just to see if I could get it to settle at all. You can kind of get an idea where it ended up at. That's probably right around 3/4 of an inch from where we were, so I think how I did it worked out pretty good measuring. It looks pretty level all the way around. And I went ahead and softened up the suspension too. If you guys didn't know, this is how it's done. There's just a little dial at the top of the shock tower, and then there's 2 in the trunk. Each side has one. It's 30 clicks, so I just set the front to 15 and the rear to 16. I'm going to start there, kind of play with it, see where I want it at. But it should soften up the ride a little bit because it was really bad before. It should definitely keep it from rubbing now. So anyways, I think that's it. I think that's it for today in general. So I tried to keep this video real short. Didn't have much time today, but I needed to get this done, and I kind of wanted to make a video on it since I couldn't find much on how to do the rear. Any questions, leave them in the comments.